What's up guys, and thank you for stopping by the channel. Today's project is this very special Ryobi trimmer, and the problem is it's not been used for a couple of years and now it won't start. Let's see if we can find out what's wrong with it and hopefully fix it. Now for the reason why this Ryobi is so special. This trimmer is fitted with a push button start that's supposed to make starting really simple. Besides the buttons near the throttle lever, the biggest giveaway is the motor and the gearbox on the back of the engine. I haven't looked at the instructions for this trimmer yet, but I'm sure after you prime the fuel system, all you need to do is move the rocker switch to the start position to get going. And if you want to stop it, just move the rocker position to the stop position. Now I can't wait to try this feature out as I've never tried one like this before. And unfortunately, we will not be using the electric start feature on this trimmer as this thing did not come with a battery. And so the first problem is that the primer bulb is missing, so we're going to have to replace it when we look at the carburetor. Next thing to do is to pull the rope over and feel if there's any resistance from the engine. And it looks like we have more than enough compression for this engine to actually start and run. What we're going to do next is take the air filter cover off and then try to take the carburetor off. It looks as though the fuel lines are missing, which usually isn't a good sign. More than likely someone may have started repairing this trimmer and then stopped short because of a serious problem. We're obviously going to have to run some new fuel lines though. After disconnecting the throttle linkage, we can now take the carburetor apart and see if there's any problems. We're going to start on the side where the primer bulb would have been, and what we're looking for is any debris in the carburetor or if the pumping diaphragm isn't flat. Well, luckily there isn't any debris in the carburetor, but if yours has some, just use some carburetor cleaner to spray it out. Well, our pumping diaphragm is mostly flat and the two little check valve flaps are lying parallel with the rest of the diaphragm. If it's difficult to tell, remove the diaphragm from the plate to fully inspect it. And luckily this diaphragm is in decent shape, so let's move on to the other side of the carburetor to inspect the metering diaphragm. Okay, it's not in bad shape, and that's because it's still just a little bit flexible, but it's quite deformed. Its normal resting position is much lower than it's supposed to be. And if we compare the old diaphragm with a new one, it's a night and day difference. We're definitely going to have to replace the old one. So install the new metering diaphragm and its plate, and then we'll move to the other side and put it back together, and of course including a new primer bulb. If you're uncomfortable dealing with rebuilding the carburetor, you might want to consider buying a new carburetor for about $10 to $12. However, metering diaphragms are much cheaper at about $2 to $3 each. And now that the carburetor is back together, it's now time to tackle the fuel lines. And luckily for us, the fuel filter and its retaining spring are still in the fuel tank. If yours doesn't have a spring, I wouldn't worry about it. This is also when we realize that the cork gasket on the fuel cap is broken, so we're going to have a leak if we fill it up. When we try to put fuel into the fuel tank, we're not going to put too much in, otherwise it will leak. To run the new fuel lines, first cut the line at a sharp angle, and this will help us get the line into the tank first. Then we'll follow up with some pliers. Pull the line up to the top and then cut off the angle piece. This is going to be our return line. And of course, you're going to do the same thing for the next fuel line that we're going to run. This one will be our fuel filter line. And the only difference is that when you cut the angled end off, what you'll do is insert the spring over the fuel line, and then you'll follow that with the fuel filter itself. Make sure there's plenty of line in the tank so the filter can move on the opposite side of the fuel tank away from the fuel cap. This will ensure that you don't starve the engine of any gas if you should turn the trimmer on its side to do any edging. So we're now ready to install the carburetor to the engine. The first thing you want to do is reconnect the throttle linkage to the carburetor and then follow that up with the fuel lines. So the lower port on the carburetor is for the fuel filter line from the tank, while the top port is for the return line. Before replacing the filter base, make sure the throttle works and that there's no binding. And before we go any further, let's add some fuel into the tank and try priming the fuel system. If the fuel comes in by the lower line and fills up the primer bulb and then leaves out of the top line, we are then assured that the fuel lines are ran correctly and that the carb is not clogged either. So ours looks to be working just fine. So replace the filter cover and then flip the choke on, and let's try starting this trimmer. Well, it didn't start, so let's prime the fuel system again and try starting it one more time. Well, it still didn't start, so let's check to see if it has any spark at the engine. I'm going to be using this spark checker, which you can get online for about $5. It simply plugs in line with the spark plug wire and lights up orange when there's spark and when you pull over the engine. And once it's installed, all you need to do is pull the engine over. So I had to slow the video down, but you can see that it does have spark. And if you don't want to use a spark checker, you can use the original spark plug to help check for spark. All you'll need to do is remove the plug and insert it back into the spark plug wire. And since there's so much plastic around the engine, you'll need a long metal tool to touch the metal on the engine and ground the spark plug out to it. I'm going to be using this spark plug removal tool to touch the engine, but you can use a flathead screwdriver if you want to. I have the tool squeezed in between the housing and the top of the engine. Do not put the tool into the spark plug hole. And unfortunately, the spark is so weak it's not really visible on camera, but it was there. Since the spark plug is out, we might as well install a compression tester and find out how healthy our engine actually is. The compression tester will show us how much cylinder pressure the engine can produce and give us an idea of how worn the rings are. And the results are almost about 75 psi, which is very good. So we definitely have more than enough compression to start and run. And after getting the good results from the compression tester, let's remove it, replace the spark plug and the wire. So I'm getting very desperate here to get this engine running, so I'm going to use starter fluid. Yes, I'm very aware I shouldn't do this, but this is just the one time and it really shouldn't hurt the engine. And fortunately for us, it did run for just a little bit. Now let's try starting it again, but this time normally. Well, it started and ran under choke and partial choke, but it didn't run very well under no choke. It obviously wants more fuel to run. So it looks like we're going to need to adjust the carburetor to add more fuel. This particular carburetor uses the Packman carb adjustment tool, and you can buy this online for only a couple of dollars. So when inserting the Packman tool into the carburetor, you're going to need to find that one position where the tool actually grabs the screw, and that's one problem with this style of tool. Here's a shot of the carburetor where these screws are located. You can also see the letter L and the H markings for each screw. So the L screw is for adjusting the fuel levels at idle speeds, while the H is for wide open throttle adjustments. So we already know that it doesn't like to idle off a choke, so I'm going to go ahead and turn the L screw counterclockwise about a quarter turn to give the engine more fuel just to idle. And so after I got the engine idling, I had to turn the L screw out another quarter turn, but then it died. It now needs more RPMs to keep from dying, so I'm going to turn the idle adjustment screw clockwise a whole turn. Now let's try restarting it once more. Well, after getting the engine to idle, we still needed more fuel so it wouldn't bog down when squeezing the throttle. We also needed more fuel at wide open throttle, but it still wasn't getting up to full speed. We're going to address this in a later video, but at least it's running. So my question to you is, have you used a Ryobi trimmer before? And if you did, would you suggest anybody else to try one? I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate your time. Please feel free to ask any questions, and I hope to see you in my next video.